Today I'm going to talk about primes and zoom lenses. Not really primes versus zoom lenses. It's not really like an either or thing, but sort of like the benefits and disadvantages of each one, and like if you can only afford like one lens or something, why you should get one versus the other potentially. And I'm not doing this because like a much more successful and much more finished YouTuber did a recent series about primes versus zooms. I'm doing it because I recently sold a handful of lenses and other equipment in order to fund getting a couple of zoom lenses. So basically, what's the difference between a prime lens and a zoom lens, aside from the obvious? In general, and I'll try to get into some more specifics as they come up, but in general, zooms are more expensive, bigger, heavier, not as sharp, and not as fast as prime lenses. And as a quick aside, what is a fast lens? What does it mean to be fast? A fast lens is one that has a wide aperture, and it's a photography term. The reason they call it a fast lens is that typically in photography, for the most part, you want to build, if like you have a moving subject, you want to be able to freeze that motion and not have blur. So in order to do that, you need a shutter speed to be fast enough to stop and freeze the motion. But in order to get an adequate exposure, you need a really a wide aperture. So basically a fast lens is one that allows you to get a good exposure with a fast shutter speed. Slow lens would be one that doesn't allow you to do that. So that's what that means. Okay, so back to it. So the big advantage, obviously, with zoom, you have all those disadvantages, right? They're more expensive, heavier, generally bigger, generally not as sharp, generally not as fast, but you have one lens that takes the place of multiple lenses. So for instance, on this 24 to 70, I was able to replace a 24, a 35, and a 50, but really that also includes a 28, a 42. I mean, there are other weird, focal lengths that aren't your more common ones. And then obviously it goes all the way to 70 millimeters. So that's a good 4 or 5 lenses that this one lens takes the place of. But this is much heavier than any one of those primes was. It weighs more than 2 pounds. And, so that's the big disadvantage. Okay, so what are the big advantages of the primes? They are sharper and potentially faster. So if absolute image quality, absolute sharpness, and is of concern to you, then you'll have to get a prime lens. And if you just need those extra stops of light, then you'll probably just have to get a prime lens. So a fast zoom is typically a 2.8. There are some faster zooms. I know Sigma makes 1.8, but that's a crop sensor lens. So there are some faster zooms, but typically a 2.8 is a fast zoom. Primes go all the way down to like a 1.2 for full frame. There might be some faster special case lenses. So you can get much brighter, wider apertures with a prime lens. Another consideration is shallow depth of field. So with a prime, getting the absolute shallowest depth of field, you're going to need to get a prime lens. Other considerations, would be just the fact that they're smaller and lighter. If you just need to if you need to minimize the overall weight of your camera, then a prime would be the way to go. So if you're using it on a gimbal, glide cam type situation, having a small light prime is going to save you the most weight versus a zoom lens. In terms of price, like I said, they're cheaper. So when I bought like this whole set, it was probably cheaper than one of those zoom lenses new. But each individual lens, these are Rokinons. They're not like the most expensive lens, but they're good. They're good for video. But these are sub $500 for each lens. The 35 is the most expensive, and the 50 is the cheapest. But they range between like, I don't know, $400 to $500. But they also have a 14. That probably is the most expensive one. But I didn't have the 14. In comparison, new, this lens is 12 or 1300. So yeah, you could get 2.5 or 3 of these, and they actually bundle these together. If you buy them as a set, you get a discount. But like I said in general before, there are other factors that you can take into consideration in terms of price, size, and weight. If you're really, the size and weight aspect of this is the most pronounced on a full frame sensor or lenses that can cover a full frame, because you can obviously use a full frame lens on smaller sensor cameras, but not vice versa. But if you are on micro four thirds, for instance, the whole size and weight issue kind of goes out the window. So I've got a zoom here and a prime here, and they're relatively the same size dimensionally speaking, but the prime lens is quite a bit heavier than the zoom lens, and that's because this is a really fast lens at 0.95, so the glass is bigger and heavier, and the construction of this lens is it just has a more, it's just a heavier metal that they used in it, not necessarily higher quality. This is a really high quality solid lens, but this is just heavier. And so this is just a prime, just one fixed focal length, and then you've got the zoom. So if you're on a smaller sensor system, like a micro four thirds or APS-C, those differences are going to be mitigated. APS-C zooms are bigger than the prime lenses, but the zooms aren't as big as a full frame zoom. Full frame mirrorless, so I don't have any full frame mirrorless lenses. Full frame mirrorless zoom lenses. I have a full frame mirrorless prime lens, and it's tiny. It's like a micro four thirds size lens, but this covers full frame. This weighs not a whole lot, pretty light, but for some reason, all of the full frame mirrorless zoom lenses might as well be DSLR lenses. They're just almost as big as this. So not a huge difference when you're talking about mirrorless versus SLR for zooms on full frame. Another important thing you need to know about zoom lenses is that you have constant aperture zooms. So this is a constant aperture, so no matter where you zoom it, so from 24 all the way to 70, the aperture will stay the same. So if you have it on a 2.8, you're going to get the same light transmission throughout the zoom range. They do have variable aperture zooms, which are lighter, smaller, and cheaper. But what that means is that as you zoom, the aperture is going to close down simultaneously. So if you want the same exposure, you're going to have to change something else because you're going to lose light as you zoom through the aperture. So typically, like a kit lens that you get is going to be a variable aperture zoom lens. They also have fixed aperture zooms that, like f4.0 is a pretty common one for full frame. And those are also smaller, lighter, and cheaper than a 2.8. Glass elements are smaller, so the whole lens basically shrinks down and gets much cheaper. The Canon 24-70 f2.8 is like $1,600, but the f4 version they make is like sub $1,000, so it's a huge difference in price. And when you're talking about a full frame sensor, an f4 is pretty sufficient. F2.8, it's one full stop more, but full frame, you can do a lot with an f4. Shallow depth of field, an f4 can get you a good way, and you can save a lot of money. And once again, like, it really comes down to what it is you're doing. Event stuff, you can't really go wrong with good zooms. Narrative filmmaking, like doing short films or features, you can go either way. So I think on YouTube, there's like this common trope or this common like talking point or cliche really about, there's always these videos about getting the film look or getting that cinematic look. And, what does that mean? I don't really know exactly what that means. Like, there's probably millions of films that have been made in the history of filmmaking. So it's not like they all look the same. Like, there's no one look for film. The type of lens and the type of camera that you use is somewhere down on the list of things that make something cinematic. So people might say that zooms are like kind of cheapy looking, cheap feeling. Like, documentary or reality, sort of, which is true because, once again, documentarians want something that's fast, flexible, and adaptable. So you don't have time to swap zoom or swap lenses when something is happening in real time that you have to capture. So zooms make a lot of sense for documentary filmmaking. So people associate them with documentaries, but that's not to say that there haven't been narrative films that have utilized zoom lenses in the shot, like have actually zoomed during a scene. Robert Altman is a good example. He uses zooms a lot in his films. The dolly zoom is something that I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with. Jaws is like a really prominent example, where they're simultaneously moving the camera forward and zooming the lens out, or vice versa, which gives like a very psychologically suggestive kind of feel. TV shows like The Office utilize zooms in shots all the time, and which makes sense because it's supposed to be kind of a mockumentary, so having that documentary feel makes sense. But these are all just choices that directors and cinematographers make that suit the story and suit the feel of the scene and the show and the movie, whatever it is. But so zoom lenses can be utilized in narrative filmmaking. There's no reason that they can't be. You just have to have like the right reason to use them. Simultaneously, you can use a zoom lens to shoot a film and not zoom in the shot, but just have multiple lenses in that one lens, multiple focal lengths in that one lens, just so you don't have to swap lenses out all the time. So if you're on an ultra low budget and a really compressed time frame, having a couple zooms can save you a lot. I worked on a feature film about a month or 2 months ago, and they were shooting the entire film, so more than 100 pages. So a full feature film, they shot it in like 11 or 12 days. So shooting like 8 to 10 pages a day, and they used 2 cameras. Hello, Ashes. And they never swapped lenses. So the A cam was a 24 to 70 Canon f2.8, and the B camera was a 70 to 200 Canon f2.8. I wanted to give you kind of just a basic understanding of the differences, aside from the fact that one zooms and one doesn't. The other considerations that you can that you can account for if you're looking at zooms, you need to know about constant aperture zooms, and you also need to be aware of the differences between like an f4 and an f2.8. If you're on a full frame camera, then you can definitely save a lot of money by going with f4. Also save size and weight by going with the f4. I would also recommend, which is what I do all the time, is buying used. Lenses retain their value pretty well, and they also don't really degrade in quality. I mean, they can, but if they're taken care of, there's no reason not to go look at like a reputable reseller and get a used zoom lens. Basically, I guess what it comes down to, if you're buying, like if really you can only afford one, it's really hard to turn away from the zoom because you're basically getting multiple lenses in one lens. If you're starting out in filmmaking, I think a good way to learn filmmaking is probably by using prime lenses, because you are really forced to come to grips with what each of those focal lengths is, what its characteristics are, limitations and advantages of each one, and you don't have the crutch of just zooming in and out. I think if you're starting out and you have a zoom, maybe the tendency is to just think of it as zoomed in and zoomed out and not really accounting for like all the other differences that come with the focal lengths. But if you're more systematic about it, there's no reason that if you have a zoom lens, you can't really focus. You should pay attention to each focal length where you are and what it is doing to the image, aside from just being zoomed out and zoomed in. People might say, I've seen a lot of people on YouTube say, oh, zooms are kind of a crutch. All you have to do is move, in order to get the shot that you want with the prime. Yeah, like in a perfect situation, when there's no pressure to get what you need to get, that might be the case. But if you're shooting an event, a live thing, you only have one chance to get it, and you can't move fast enough, or you can't block someone's view or something like that, then it makes sense to have a zoom. If you're shooting a wedding and you want to get a close-up of the vows while they're happening, if you don't have a zoom lens, then you know, what are you going to do? Walk right up to them and put a camera in their face? That's probably not going to work too well. I'm sure they're not going to recommend you to anyone else they know. So I hope you found this video somewhat enlightening. And let me know in the comments if you have any quibbles or suggestions or anything, really. And see you next time.